So thank you all for coming. I'm really sorry I haven't listened. My name is Henry Bacon. I'm chair of the science
coming from the Ecuadorian.
and
Or Silicon Valley.
Whatever
way you want to call it,
exactly. I'm just going to turn this right over to Irene, who helped organize this panel, and she's going to introduce our speakers.
Sure. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I want to thank you, everyone, for coming today to discuss such an interesting topic, the transformation from our driving presence to driverless future. Imagine yourself rushing to work in a car and not worrying about getting stuck in traffic or speeding or even a parking space or having a glass of wine on your way home and not thinking about any potential consequences. Or imagine being productive in your car, working while you're driving, or taking online classes. Self-driving technology could not only give us more freedom in the car, but also could change the way we think about the transportation. To understand better how self-driving technology works, we have a short video provided to us by one of our experts, Stephen Wu, who is actually in California right now, but he is appearing via Skype. So I'm going to play this video for a short amount of time. Hopefully it works.
Aim it towards Stephen when he's not.
Okay. Yeah, we just had it, but
It's just buffering.
So whenever you present on technology, it never works. This goes to the connected issue too.
No, it's not. Turned off. Wait. There's a different one.
Engineer Martin Hempel stepped into a sleek sedan for an afternoon drive. A sleek sedan for an afternoon.
Reporter Craig Miller has the story.
Engineer Martin Hempel stepped.
Just bomb on a computer stuff.
Into a sleek sedan for an afternoon drive in Belmont, California. But once they get on the highway, it's clear this isn't your typical drive, nor is this like any other car on the road.
And the only thing I have to do now is press those two buttons and let go of the steering wheel. Now the car is taking over the complete driving task. What you see here is the first generation of an automated driving system. The car doesn't assist you anymore. It is in charge of driving.
Welcome to the future of driving. Cars smart enough to drive themselves. Prototypes of self-driving cars are already on the road in Singapore, Sweden, and here in Silicon Valley.
I'm excited about self-driving cars.
Raj Nair is Ford's chief technology officer. The automaker's new Ford Edge can spot and pull into parking spaces.
Over the 100 years of the industry, there's been a lot of great technologies introduced, but the self-driving vehicle, I think, is in a different category.
Self-driving cars could redefine how we drive and how we live. When machines can take over the wheel, motorists can use their time in new ways, says Nidhi Kalra, an information scientist with the RAND Corporation.
If we don't have to sit behind a steering wheel looking out at the road and instead can be productive while we're in our cars, that changes the way we work. Do we read? Do we educate ourselves? Do we play? What do we do? It changes what it means to get in a car.
System is active.
Major automakers such as Mercedes, Audi, and Ford have opened research centers in Silicon Valley to develop technologies that enable cars to sense and interpret the road. Tech giants are also racing to automate automobiles. In September, Apple met with officials at the DMV to discuss autonomous vehicles, adding to reports that it plans to release a self-driving car in a few years. Since 2009, Google has been developing and testing self-driving cars near its offices in Mountain View. This is Google's latest prototype. It's driverless and can go up to 25 miles per hour.
They're going with the driverless car concept, where you have a removable steering wheel, you may or may not have a rear view mirror, and it's designed to operate at low speeds. A lot of automakers are taking a different approach, which is to have a vehicle in which the human driver drives some of the time and the car drives some of the time. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has developed levels of autonomy. Levels 1 and 2 are where 1 or 2 functions are automated, like adaptive cruise control and lane keeping. Level 3 is where the car can, for some period of time, really take the responsibility for driving. And level 4 is when there's no one responsible for the driving task other than the car itself. You may not be able to buy a level 4 car until 2025, 2030, but we're going to start seeing those vehicles come into our lives much sooner than I think a lot of people are anticipating.
But UC Berkeley transportation engineer Stephen Schladover thinks it'll take decades before cars can safely navigate all the complex situations human drivers encounter.
To develop that software to the level that it can be as safe as a skilled human driver or even as an average human driver is a huge challenge. On average, a vehicle will drive 3.3 million hours between fatal crashes, or 65,000 hours between injury crashes. Think of what it would take to get a mobile phone that wouldn't have a software fault in millions of hours of operation. But if the computer that's driving the vehicle suffers that failure, somebody could indeed die.
Roughly 33,000 people in the U.S. die each year in car accidents. More than 90% of those accidents are due to human error.
I have a 15-year-old daughter about to get her license, and I am terrified of the thought of her being licensed to drive. And, it's not that I don't trust her. What I don't know is how people are going to drive around her. But computers do not get tired. They don't fall asleep. I definitely believe that self-driving cars are going to make our roadways safer.
Bernard Soriano is the deputy director of the Department of Motor Vehicles. In 2014, the agency issued rules for testing autonomous cars in California.
With the testing regulations, we want to ensure that there's a person, a human being in the vehicle that's capable and qualified to be able to take over control if there's a problem.
To get a testing permit, companies must have $5 million worth of insurance to handle any claims arising from accidents. Along with California, Nevada, Michigan, the District of Columbia, and Florida also have regulations for self-driving vehicles, and that can pose a challenge for car makers.
When you go from California to Nevada, for example, we have to switch license plates every time we drive over the border, which is kind of not useful. What we'd really like to have is a federal regulation that is the same everywhere.
But at the moment, there are no federal safety regulations.
The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration typically is the one that develops those rules and regulations. They felt it was premature to have regulations around public operation of these vehicles because it's such a new technology.
In June, the DMV released data on accidents involving 6 self-driving cars and standard cars. The self-driving cars were not at fault, and some lawyers think technology may may help determine who is to blame when humans and machines share the wheel.
While it's being driven by you, I think you would be responsible. While it's driving itself, then the manufacturer would be responsible. In both the California and the Nevada regulations, every self-driving car has to have what I call a black box, much like the black box in an airplane, which preserves the last 30 seconds prior to any accident.
Self-driving vehicles could also make it safer and easier for the disabled and seniors to get around.
I am 72 years old and I can't wait for self-driving cars. The thrill of driving a car in my teenage years is long past. I want to be driven.
And if the thrill of driving is replaced by the thrill of being driven, some may question owning a car at all.
You could call up a vehicle on your phone, it'll pick you up, drop you immediately to your destination, and carry on helping someone else. So the need to own a car becomes less and less, and without a driver, it can be cheaper and more convenient to share a car than it is to own a car.
In the future, your car may even zip along an automated highway with its own license to drive.
So how should we prepare for the driverless future? Should we carry a driver's license? Who will own the data that car collects? And who will be responsible for the car accident? All of those questions we will discuss today with our panelists and our experts. So I want to introduce to you our panelists, Mr. Rodriguez, who is a privacy and transportation regulation expert, Professor Dolan, professor at University of Baltimore. He teaches towards intellectual property. Matt DePaul, General Counsel of Cruise Automation at General Motors, and my data law professor, cybersecurity expert, and our moderator, Rick Gordon. So I'll have you to take from here.
Thank you. So I guess first, I think maybe I'm going to just ask you, each of you, to just give a little bit more about what you do and where you come from and kind of what your interest is in this area. So Matt, you might. Oh, actually, sorry, Steve, can you hear me?
I can't hear you very well, sorry.
Okay, so Steve, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for appearing from the Ecuadorian embassy in Silicon Valley. So Steve, can you give a little bit of your background and your interest in this area, what you're doing?
Yes, I've been involved in information technology law for a long time. I started computer law back in the 1980s. I started doing internet law in the 1990s, and then in 2007 decided that this thing about artificial intelligence and robotics would be a big thing. So for the last 10 years, I've been working with people at Stanford and with the American Bar Association section of Science and Technology Law to work on artificial intelligence and robotics issues, among other things, including big data, Internet of Things, homeland security, other types of things. But I see artificial intelligence and robotics as important trends, and we need to be prepared today for the changes that we will be facing tomorrow. And autonomous driving is one of the first applications for robotics where I think we'll see a lot of legal issues because we will have these accidents that will cause, in some cases, catastrophic harm. I helped start an artificial intelligence and robotics committee in the ABA section of Science and Technology Law. I would be glad to talk about that. If anybody has any questions or wants to join, I'm glad to give you information about that. And since then, I've been doing programs and writing, and now some client work in that area. And some of the work that I've done includes writing a Think Piece Showcase publication book chapter on product liability related to autonomous driving. I can send you the link to the book, and you can download the entire book. It's free, available for people to download in its entirety. The foundation was kind enough to make it available for people.
Oh, thank you, Steve. You can tell my friend Steve's a real slacker. So Matt, if you follow that one up and just give a little.
Sure, and I should be clear, I'm not the general counsel of General Motors. Craig would be a little put off if I tried to claim that. I'm the general counsel of Cruise Automation, which was bought by General Motors last year. We still operate as a independent subsidiary out in Silicon Valley. Not entirely independent. We work very closely with GM and are pretty tightly integrated at this point, but they let me keep my job. And I do all the legal work for Cruise, or I oversee it. That runs the gamut from your run-of-the-mill employment disputes to the more interesting things that we're talking about here. Hopefully I'm not offending any employment attorneys out there. So that's it.
Okay, so Mr. Dolan?
Sure. I think I'm the person on this panel who, has never had a real job or, or doesn't have one now. And I was invited here, but I do well with waving my arms around a lot. So there's that. But my area of teaching, as Irene mentioned, is both intellectual property, where I both teach and write, and torts, where I mostly teach. I don't really write in torts, but I do sort of teach in it, and it's an area of interest. And so why here is because I think this is a fascinating technology, and it touches on both of those topics. One is how do we, on one hand, certainly incentivize it, of which I think about a lot. How do we use intellectual property to incentivize and speed up this technology, but while at the same time making sure that we don't slice and dice it so finely that it would be hard for a patent holder on car A to interact with a patent holder on particularly new technology of traffic light switching and so on. And torts, well, as we'll talk about, there's lots and lots of torts issues here. So,
and Greg, if you might.
Sure. Well, first of all, good evening, everybody. Hope you all doing well. It's nice to be in New York from Washington, D.C. I'm always amazed in New York because, you all do things so late. So when, Henry told us that we're starting this panel at 6:30, I did kind of a double take, but I'm like, it's New York. So thank you all for being here on a rainy night. So I'm coming at this from a perspective of local governments. And I think, Cruise is a type of company that our clients are looking to partner with. And to get to some of the questions that we talked about at the introduction, how are we going to get there? How are we going to make sure these are effectively integrated into our transportation system? It's going to take a lot more testing, just like the gentleman said on the video. And that's where I think public and private need to do these partnerships. And some of the big issues that we're dealing with our clients is how do we share that data in a safe way that allows the innovation to continue, that keeps the intellectual property safe and the proprietary information that a lot of these companies are invested in right now. How do you keep it safe? But also to share the information with cities to make sure that everybody's learning from each other. And I think the infrastructure is a big question. And the other thing that we're working with, and one of the guides that you all might be interested in, is we work with the National League of Cities. We prepared a conversation starter because a lot of elected officials are becoming interested in this but don't necessarily understand how to communicate this with the public. And so I think that's an opportunity for us to work with cities on the public education and public outreach side. So those are some of the things I'm working on, and look, I'm very happy to be a part of this panel, and thank you all for being here.
So thank you. As you can see, we've got a panel of people with some very different perspectives, which I think are going to mesh very well. So, but the first thing I'd like to talk about is the technology. Like, what does this really mean? What is a self-driving car? What are the technologies involved? How does this work? So Matt, if you're closest to this, I think. So if you might, let us know.
Sure.
At least where it is and where you think it's going. That'd be great.
Okay. So as we saw in the video, there's a pretty well-regarded classification of autonomous cars that goes from level 1 to 5. Levels 4 and 5 are in your mind of the future. The car drives itself. You could be facing backwards. You never have to drive ever. Level 3 is sort of a 50-50 type scenario where the car can do the driving in a lot of situations, but it still relies on you. And levels 2 and 1 are more reliant on the person. Cruise is working on level 4 and 5, but General Motors also has a level 2 product called Super Cruise that will drive you on the highway. So in self-driving cars, I'll go at the highest level, level 5, because that's going to have all the good stuff on it. There's 3 core sensors, but there's a lot of sort of ancillary sensors that are involved. But the 3 core ones are cameras, radar, and LiDAR. And LiDAR is like radar, but with lasers, so it's cooler and more expensive. But each of those have their benefits and drawbacks. And the reason you have three of them is because if you layer them on top of each other, you get very good coverage of what you need when you're driving. Self-driving cars aren't magical. They can't do things that they don't. They're not magical. So if a person has a problem seeing over a hill, so does a self-driving car. There are certain things that people can't do very well see through fog, but radar can see through fog fairly well. So that's one of the benefits of having radar. And then another thing that's important for self-driving cars is maps. Currently at levels 4 and 5, the cars rely on a pre-drawn or pre-collected map. You take a car out and you map the road. You get a very detailed picture of the world. And the reason for this is people would expect that a self-driving car would rely on GPS to know where it is. GPS is pretty inaccurate. As we know, or as you all know here, when you walk out in downtown, your GPS has got you 3 blocks away because of these urban canyons between buildings. And while GPS is getting better, it's not accurate to the point where you need to be when you're driving. So the way highly autonomous vehicles work for mapping or for knowing where they are, it's called localization, is they take this base map that's been collected, and then while they're driving, they're taking active pictures with their radar and their LiDAR and their cameras, and they fit what the image they have on top of what they're seeing, and that tells you where it is. So it's sort of that game that you used to see on the back of a cereal box of what's different. That's happening live everywhere you go. And so when you fit yourself on top of your previous image, you know where you are. So that's mapping. Those are the sensors. I don't know if that was explanatory or not, but maybe you can prod me and I can give descriptions.
So what is it going to take for, so let me ask her, are there what happens to the big rainstorm, other atmospheric things? Are there things that actually could, even at the levels 4 and 5, be disruptive so that if somebody had a truly autonomous vehicle, it would stop?
Certainly. So an easy one, if you take that map example, is if you take a bunch of the things that were on my base map away. So if you knock down all the buildings that were there before, the car is going to say, this looks different. I don't know where I am. I'm going to stop. But then other things that bother people bother self-driving cars. So if there's a blizzard, it's pretty hard to see with your cameras, and the lasers coming out of your LiDAR are bouncing off of snowflakes, which makes things tricky. So we don't have blizzards in San Francisco, but we have rain. And like people do, when it's raining outside, we drive a little bit slower because we can't see quite as far. Then there's the catastrophic things, in Ocean's 11, when they launch an EMP, that causes problems for electronics, causes problems for self-driving cars. But those are some big ones.
So can I ask a question? Just for curious technology. So, I have had until my dad crashed it, slightly fancier car than, my first one. My very first one was 1980 Chevy Citation and had no sensors almost of any kind. The car that my dad crashed just a month ago was still like 6-7 years old, but it was a nice little BMW 3 Series. And it has all sorts of sensors like underneath the bumper, and so sometimes you hit like a pothole, right, a little piece of stone, they knock out a sensor, and the car is still drivable, but it tells me, your outside temperature is like 200 degrees, because that's just, right, or things like that. So what happens if a driverless car hits a pothole and one of the things that emits lasers that little glass gets cracked? Does it stop that? How does it respond to that?
Yeah, it would be immediately obvious. So I talked about that layering. When you get an anomaly, you wonder what's wrong, and it'd be very noticeable. So the way it's framed is there are fail operational states. So certain faults, the car can still limp home at, say, a lower speed. Other faults, the car shouldn't be driving, so it won't be. The trick is figuring out which classification goes into each and making sure that you do notice these aberrations.
So how far away are we
That is
from this? Forgetting that we'll get into the regulation. I'm just talking from a technology standpoint.
So it depends on which level you're talking about and the scope. So there are level 2 cars on the road now. You can buy a Tesla and it's got autopilot and it'll drive you on the highway. GM's coming out with a similar product this year. And I think some other manufacturers have them out right now. For a level 4 or 5 where, I can turn around backwards or sit in the back seat the whole time and just say, take me home. I think that we'll be able to do that in constrained environments in the next couple of years. By constrained environments, one way that you can make the problem easier is to limit the problems that your car will face. So things that are more difficult are weather, higher speeds, high pedestrian environments, high traffic environments. So if you take, my self-driving car right now, I could put it in a parking lot and drive in circles, and we could all get in it and drive for 1 million miles. So you can do that now. Well, no, you can't because I won't let you, but I can do it now. So that it just depends on where and what.
Okay. Steve, any thoughts on that one? What do you think?
I would think that it's going to be like 2035 before we see domination of autonomous vehicles on the roadway. But I think in the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to see it start to deploy. But it takes a generation to turn over an entire fleet. So there's going to be a transition period where we'll have a mixed environment.
So I've heard some people say that it's going to come to trucking first, that and it may be long haul trucking on highways. Anybody? So thoughts on?
I wanted to also comment that in our case, so buying a car is a lot different than getting in one. The sensors and the technology now are, for the most part, a lot of them are new, and they're very expensive, and they're very finely tuned. And when you go over your pothole, something gets maladjusted, somebody needs to fix it, and you don't want to take it into the shop. So it'll be longer before you can buy one of these cars, but it will be sooner that you can get in one that gets a touch every day from the manufacturer who can make sure it's dialed in. So for us,
transportation as a service.
Yes, TaaS, as we call it. For us, that's the first public availability that you'll have. Trucking, I can't comment on that. We're not working on it.
Okay. So let's talk about the regulation on this, because that's...
Hey, Rick?
Yeah.
I wondered if now might be a time to talk about some of the images that I had and the history of autonomous driving.
Oh, sure.
And some slides. I don't know if you have the ability to show them, or we could maybe circle back at some point. But I had some pictures of them so people have some examples.
It's loading right now.
We're loading. Hold on a second.
And maybe while we have a moment here, just to jump in on the kind of shared mobility that's happening right now. I mean, I think that's probably something, a lot of car companies are teaming up with the Ubers and Lyfts of the world to potentially have these autonomous fleets out there in the next 3 to 5 years. So you already see it happening now with Ubers starting to partner with local governments and cities. And this goes to thinking about the land use and planning side of things. So we're starting to really work with some of our clients on the planning side to think about how should we think about new buildings? Should you be investing in that new parking garage, or should you be looking at how is shared mobility going to impact this? And to the question about autonomous vehicles in our streets and potentially in our highways, this gets to the question of whether or not we need to be thinking about managed lanes, because in my mind that could speed up deployment potentially, but it also means that we sacrifice a lane within the city, and we already know there's some dispute about that with regard to bike lanes and dedicated bus lanes. So that's a broader conversation that we'll be thinking about of how do we have the environment to allow these cars to be deployed.
Thanks. Okay, Steve. So we have the slides up.
Okay, can you see the red and white car?
We can.
I'm going to say go Cardinal on that one.
So what you're seeing here is the Shelley TT Auto, and that is the main car of the Stanford Center for Automotive Research. And they're testing these cars on tracks to try to put them into high-speed tests, figuring that if they can match the behavior of professional drivers, then they can use the lessons learned to show what how they behave in the environment of that would have useful lessons for driving on normal roads. This is one of the older Google games, now known as Waymo, and this is the more current version of it. Some people refer to it as a koala model because you can kind of see it as a funny face on the front, kind of looking like this. But this particular gentleman who's riding it is blind, so that's kind of the thing that we do with that. When I give these talks, I did a little experiment. I said, what is the first driverless car litigation in reporting cases? And the answer is from the 1920s, if you can believe it. The first case having to do with driverless cars was in the 1920s. But the thing was, it was a trademark matter because there were two companies with driverless cars. They were essentially rental car companies. And what they meant by driverless car was that they would give you the car, but they would not provide you with a chauffeur. So going forward in history, and back in the 1920s, people were looking at radio technology in order to try to do remote controls of cars. So this was a military experiment that you see a picture here where a truck was driving behind this test vehicle and steering it. And in the 1930s, there were other remote control experiments with full-size vehicles so that people could try to control them by radio. And then in the 1930s, we moved more towards the vision of thinking about this urban planning future where we would have guide wire systems in the roads, built into the roads to guide cars, and the vehicles would follow electromagnetic wires sunk into the roads, and that would regulate their speed and steering. And then as time went on, we had World War II, and we had more sophisticated systems like radar, and people were starting to think about using magnetic detection to figure out where the cars were and help guide the cars, and use that radar to regulate the distance between the cars. But this is sort of this post-war era where we were now fleshing in this urban planning idea. And then as time went on, we had the 1950s where people were thinking that we're going to move this to this utopia of this more family-centered society, which family togetherness meant a lot of things. So this vision of autonomous vehicles is one where people were thinking this is going to be like a living room on wheels. And it's like this golden age of the family. And around this time, people were building the interstate highway system. There was a film that came out that Disney put out in 1958 called Magic Highway USA, where they had this idea of autonomous driving. But over time, people saw it's not working out maybe as fast as we thought. Autonomous driving's always been like, it's coming in 20 years, but it never gets there. So they thought about things like cruise control. In the 1960s, we had Herbie the Love Bug. We had the media showing like the Christie horror novel and movie in 1983, this malicious car. We had microelectronics revolution in the 1970s with more intelligence and on board, and starting to see those systems built into cars over time. And in the 1980s and 1990s, we had Knight Rider and machine vision systems coming into place. And in the 1990s, science fiction started with showing autonomous vehicles. In the 2000s, like the movie Total Recall, Minority Report, and I, Robot. In 1997 or thereabouts, there was this idea of this automated highway concept where you would drive your car to an entrance of something like Highway 5 or 15, these are freeways, sort of like 95, and you put your car in a long train of cars. It's called a platoon. That concept is still being used today. One of my clients is doing truck platooning, so when you talk about freight truck automation, that's one of the ways that you can gradually move towards autonomous driving in trucks. But overall, that never got put into place. But we're seeing a lot more interest in this kind of thing now because we can see the ever-powerful expansion of computing. We can see computers becoming more powerful, exponentially so, and the costs are going down dramatically while the power is rising dramatically. And altogether, we've got a number of technologies that work together. So if you think about an autonomous vehicle, look at this picture. It's like a hub and spoke. At the edge of it, we've got the fact that an autonomous vehicle is a robot, a form of robot. It may have a social networking capability, an in-dash system like a tablet computer that you might see in the in-dash system. It's a mobile computer. It's receiving a lot of data in the form of mapping. It's throwing off a lot of data so that people can monitor traffic. It's part of the Internet of Things. It's connected by the cloud to other devices or infrastructure. It may have an augmented reality screen. Maybe not so much 3D printing, but that's another technology that we're seeing. Privacy and security technologies. People are trying to think about how to protect communications between vehicles and infrastructure. And people are even trying to integrate wearable devices with the car so that if let's say you were having a heart attack or something like that, the car might know that to alert you and to take you to the hospital, something along those lines. The point of this slide in part is to say all of these technologies work together in this vision of pervasive computing. You can't ignore the rest of the boxes if you're just focusing on one. Or an autonomous vehicle, you can't just look at that top box and say, oh, this is all about robotics. It may be that if a car crashes, the crash didn't occur because there was something wrong with the car. It may be because the big data service provider was providing faulty data. It may be because the cloud communication service provider had some kind of vulnerability and it spread these malicious signals. We don't know how there could be a problem that arises, but you have to look at the big picture of all these technologies that work synergistically to give you this pervasive experience of autonomous driving.
So I'll just say, as a cybersecurity person, that scares the hell out of me, because every one of those boxes is a threat vector. And we'll get into the potential liabilities and all, but everything that's connected becomes more. There's more of a threat associated with it. So I guess I'd like to get the panel's view here on just that issue, right? Autonomous vehicles have the opportunity to be safer because there's less human error. But what do we do about the attacks? So maybe let's start out, Greg, maybe start out with your thoughts on this, and we can just, and Irene, I guess I'd like to hear you too, but let's just go down and let's see what people, I'd love to hear what each of you has to think about that one.
Absolutely. So it's a very, very tough issue. You see it happening in the news right now. Some people are pleading the fifth when it comes to complicated issues with it, whether or not you're dealing with certain threats or whether or not you are planning for the future. But from our perspective, with local governments, local governments are barely getting up to speed and understanding that they are vulnerable to these types of attacks. Everybody thought that it was the big businesses, the banking institutions. Rick and I were talking about this, but now with this type of model, and if all these vehicles are going to be connected, and if you get to V2I, which is vehicle to infrastructure, you're going to need an infrastructure where this is connected to. So for example, let's say the city of New York's infrastructure. If you have somebody that can hack into a vehicle, they can arguably then hack into the infrastructure and maybe take control of every single vehicle that's hooked into the infrastructure. So this is a big issue that goes down to Rick and I were talking about. It's the foundations around this technology. So autonomous vehicles are part of everything happening with smart cities right now. And a big part of the foundations are going to be cybersecurity, they're going to be privacy, and they're going to be making sure that our law enforcement knows how to interact with these new technologies. So it's this great opportunity. This is why these panels are great. It's this great opportunity to have this conversation, make sure it's multidisciplined so that we put in the right foundation to make sure that we're operating and testing these vehicles within what I call a framework of safety.
So let me just pick up where Greg left off and talk about privacy. And although this is not my core area of research or interest, but nonetheless, I have colleagues for whom it is, and so we talk about it a lot. And in fact, just the other day, I was speaking to my colleague about technology police officers use to track your cell phones. And there's a big question: do they need a warrant? Do they not need a warrant? Now, it's true that it seems to me that the younger generation just, at least on the surface, appears not to care about privacy. I mean, we now post everything from, time we wake up to the time we go to sleep and possibly after on Instagram and on Twitter. I still don't really know what those two things do, but I'm sticking with Facebook. But apparently people use them and do things with them. At the same time, when time comes for police investigation, there's a big question: what can police do? And there's a concept in the Fourth Amendment, and if you voluntarily share your data or share anything with a third party, you've almost definitionally you've lost any expectation of privacy there, unless it's unless it's your spouse or something along those lines. If you are sharing your data with the city, right, with the mobile, whatever, Verizon, with all of those boxes. And as you mentioned, like how do we teach police to interact with the technology? Well, the easy way is to say, they have access to all of it, right? And that may cause us to rethink our Fourth Amendment protections. That may cause us to rethink how much information do we give to the police. So there's that. And then, of course, in terms of cybersecurity, it's not just, certainly there's this sort of hacking issue, but it goes back to what I asked before. What happens when one of the sensors, gets hit by some sort of piece of gravel and it's broken? Well, what happens? So yesterday I was sitting at dinner with my friends with this very phone, and we were finishing dinner. We were trying to call an Uber, and we're trying, and it just wouldn't work. And we had 4 bars, and then apparently we figured out that apparently for about half an hour in that part of Washington D.C., Verizon, even though it had 4 bars, apparently something was down. So what happens when I'm on the road and whoever I'm connecting to in that box, when it's down, right? So even potentially without hacking. So does it affect just me? Does it affect other cars as well? Does it affect, how the city interacts with my cars and so on? So there's a lot of issues there that, you're right, it's quite scary as to when everything becomes very connected.
I'll tell you, when I talk about critical infrastructure, the example I use in transportation is, what if somebody shut down all the RAV4s on the LA highways all at once? That would be kind of interesting. So you must think about this quite a bit.
I do. And GM does as well. So they're, as cars get more connected and more advanced technologically, they have built an entire cybersecurity group. There's a chief cybersecurity officer who reports to the CEO. So they have a couple of their own people on site at Cruise, and we also have our own. So it's like one of the existential things for self-driving cars, as we're talking about. To perhaps help a little bit of a misconception is, for our cars, they don't have to be connected to the outside world to drive. So if I have gone and gotten my map, I can turn all my connections off and still drive. It's nice to have connections because you can do things like traffic updates and you can talk to other things. But one thing we have to be able to do is drive on our own. And so I talk to the cybersecurity guys fairly frequently, and I'm going to get this wrong, but they have sort of a process of, you have to first be aware of as much as you can, and what you're aware of you defend against. And one of the key defenses is limiting what is connected. So those vectors you talked about, cutting them off. So I might have infotainment in the car, but those wires never touch the thing that turns the steering wheel. So there are sort of hard or physical ways that you can make me watch Oprah, but you can't turn my steering wheel. So that's
We'll talk about how well that actually works in practice afterward.
Sure. But Rick, maybe just one question. I think Stephen would probably jump in on this too, and I'm interested to see what Matt thinks is. What about software updates? So let's think about, every day with the recent ransomware attacks, then you get your updates that are loaded on your Microsoft. And you think about Apple phones. How many of us jump and update our Apple phone right away? Is there going to be a point where car manufacturers need to think about an automatic push to make sure people have that software downloaded, and also thinking about from a liability perspective? They're going to have to.
Yeah, I was going to say almost certainly.
I think people have put that already.
So Steve, how about you? You've got to have thought about this.
Yesterday we had a meetup talking about different, so autonomous but connected cars. And we had a panelist, a New York lawyer, by the way, who was Mr. Roland Trope, who was talking about cybersecurity vulnerabilities in connected cars and talked about things like the communications near, right around the car with Bluetooth, and looking at the entertainment systems and the sensors and the ports that people use for repair purposes and maintenance purposes as being entry points, vulnerable entry points by which these cars could be subject to attack by, for example, the injection of malicious code. So there are a lot of attack surfaces, which is sort of the information security professionals speak for places where the car can be attacked.
Yeah, and so I'll just say there's this great book called The Cuckoo's Egg, which was one of the first cybersecurity stories. It's a true story. Pick it up, read it. But one of the things, this guy in 1970s, astronomer, ended up uncovering an East German cyber hacking gang. But one of the things was there was an air-gapped system, military system, in the 70s at a vendor, air-gapped, right? They got into it. Turned out there was a connection in the 70s. Anybody thinks that you can fully disconnect any of these systems, that you have actually, that the as-built architecture is that good? I haven't seen. I mean, maybe some of the military systems are. I'll be really surprised if the domestic, or commercial manufacturers are building to that level. Going to try, but so I'm very, very skeptical of the ability to do that for anybody. So it's an interesting topic.
But also, I think I would add that
Things that you might want to think about is we also depend on the trustworthiness of all the people who are doing repairs on these cars once they get deployed, because it just takes bribing one to have that one person introduce malicious software using a legitimate port, perhaps using equipment that was provided by the repair facility to inject malicious code into a particular car.
And I would just add that, when we talk about hacking, it doesn't necessarily have to be a situation where you inject this code so to get the car to go haywire. So even if it's true that you can disconnect the steering wheel from your video screen, there are other potential issues there. So I'm old enough to remember, when Robert Bork was nominated and he, the videos that he checked out from the local Blockbusters were leaked, and whatever he checked out from the library was released. And that was a big deal, and so there was a lot of sort of brouhaha about it. But imagine now if somebody manages, again, not just to take your car over, not to cause you to crash, but they gather information on where you are, what have you done, and they can actually release it as necessary. If this car is completely driverless, if it's one of those level 5 cars, I would imagine that people may be, while facing backwards, engaging in some sort of activities that they may not necessarily want other people to know about behind the tinted glass. But if you can take control of the video camera or of the screen in the car, you can record and broadcast to whoever you want to record it without causing the car to crash. So even if you can disconnect those things, there's a lot of other issues that are not necessarily about the driving, but about sort of perhaps lulling people in some sort of sense of security where they end up sharing with the world things that they don't want to share with the world.
It's probably also worth mentioning in our association group that there have been class actions about the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of cars. So there were lawsuits against Fiat Chrysler having to do with the G vulnerabilities. And there were a lot of highly publicized stories about the Jeeps being attacked by researchers, and there was also a very interesting 60 Minutes episode where Leslie Stahl is getting into the car. There's somebody standing at the other end of the parking lot with a handheld device, and Leslie Stahl is driving the car, and the person with the handheld device is able to start the windshield wipers, disable the brakes, cause the brakes to go on, but cause the accelerator to go forward. Those kinds of things. So it is possible to take over cars from even from the side of the road, something like that, if there are vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and I should say the Auto ISAC, the Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So there are groups with industry that are working on this and taking this very seriously. But as we've seen with a lot of other systems, we have not gotten to anywhere close to perfection with cybersecurity. So this is a perfect pivot to regulation, because now we've talked a lot about what the cars can do, what they're going to be able to do. We talked about some of the vulnerabilities, some of the issues. We haven't gotten to any of the tort stuff yet. We'll do that. But why don't we talk a little bit about what types of regulations we're starting to get in order to allow for this to happen, and where the regulations are going to go. And so, Greg, I was going to ask you to start out with that one, because you're seeing this at the ground level. So if you could let us know what kind of what is the regulation that we're starting to see now, and what kind of regulation are we going to need in order for this to be successful?
Sure. No, thank you for that. It's a great question. I mean, people would argue that being in Washington, D.C. isn't necessarily ground zero on this right now, because things have come a little bit to a halt. And I think this shows kind of the tension between government and innovation right now. Is, look at the law. The law is just catching up with technology. Now you imagine something like government trying to catch up with how do we regulate this while still fostering innovation. And I think that's where you kind of see the federal government struggling with right now. They want to take a role on the safety side and make sure cars are safe. When you think about NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, that's their wheelhouse. They are in charge of making sure your vehicles are safe and making sure that you introduce things like airbags, seatbelts to make sure your cars are safe. I mean, I'm curious, how many people even knew that there was a federal automated vehicles policy released in September of 2016? So, I mean, and that's fascinating. So for those of you watching on TV, about 5 people in a room of maybe 40 raised their hand, and you're not alone on this, and it's because this is operating within the government. People aren't necessarily watching what's going on, but if you guys have the time, it's a 115-page document divided up into 4 sections. And so this is supposed to kind of set the stage. There are only guidelines right now for how the federal government wants to see this adopted. And I think most people would agree that these were pretty balanced guidelines that were put out. But what you see happening is, because the federal government, they promised to update it within a year. That year is going to be coming up in September. Needless to say, people in the White House are more involved with other things right now than necessarily thinking about automated vehicles. So you're starting to see, you see this with drones right now as well. The private industry, who's invested a lot of money in this technology, and I'm sure Matt will say this as well, are starting to get antsy. Hey, there's a real opportunity here around this. How do we get it started? And I think this is where you're starting to see more states across the country think about adopting regulations. And so the tension there then is what the auto companies call a patchwork quilt. We don't want to have a bunch of different regulations in each state that we have to comply with that might stymie innovation and prevent us from being able to have a car to drive from California to New York. Now, for those of you who probably read articles, you probably know that New York was one of the only laws where you arguably couldn't operate an automated vehicle, because you had to have one hand on the steering wheel at all times. And that was only recently changed in your recent budget process. And now, for those of you who didn't know, you actually have an application to test automated vehicles in the city of New York right now. So if you didn't know that, you can get that on your DMV's website. And so, this is where cities are starting to think about automated vehicle pilot projects. So you have 3 different layers here. We talked about the federal, which is the federal automated vehicles policy. States are trying to position themselves as economic leaders around regulations, but there's this danger of mucking it up. If you look at the different regulations that have been passed in Tennessee, recently in Georgia, recently in Colorado, and I believe another one recently, California is working on theirs, and in New York, everybody has a different definition of what an autonomous car is. So I think this is where the federal government can have a role in saying a standard definition of this, thinking about vehicle performance, how do we make sure they're safe? And then from my perspective, the role where local governments come in here is fine. I don't think, local governments are barely catching up in understanding the potential of this technology. And I do think the potential is huge to transform the way we think about mobility, to hopefully enhance mobility for everybody. And that's the opportunity here. And I think that hopefully what we start to see is more partnerships between crews and cities to say, okay, federal government, you're taking a while to get going here. We're not going to wait for that. We want to understand how this technology can operate safely. How is it integrated into our cities? And how can we alleviate congestion? How can we get more family time? How do we, decrease those 2-hour bus rides that single mothers have to endure to try and have a better society with less congestion and more happiness? So, that's kind of my policy hat and my legal hat, but the short answer is it's still evolving, and it's kind of trying to figure out this wait and see approach, but the only way we figure out what we need is by promoting more testing. And hopefully we start to see more policies focused on demonstration projects.
So Steve and then Matt, I'm interested in, is regulation going to help or is it going to hinder? And if it's going to help, what are the good regulations and what are the bad? How is regulation going to play in here, and how is it going to actually either make this work or break it? So Steve, if you could maybe start.
Yeah, I think it can help. I think it has to be done right. There's this balancing between trying to protect the public safety through regulation, but on the other hand, trying not to stifle innovation. That's a balance that has to be carefully drawn. I think it's going to come down to the details of which particular points are we looking at where we could use the regulation. Is there, if we may say, for example, that cybersecurity is such a big risk that we need to create minimum standards or require a certification of some kind as a condition of letting it on the market, but otherwise we'll just focus on the kind of recall authority that we have if something goes wrong. Maybe we say that public safety requires some pre-market notification at least, so that at least so people can be looking at the way that it's working out to monitor the deployment of them. Right now, the states have the ability to say, as a condition of being able to test these cars, you need to come up with some kind of proof that it is that you've gone through this process of doing the safety checks. And so I think that we're seeing this trying to strike a balance between not creating a regime in which you need to go through so many layers of bureaucracy that never gets to market, but on the other hand, trying to protect public safety. I think we're just going to see the aiming to see particular point solutions that provide good regulations to protect public without an open across-the-board bureaucracy.
And just to jump on that point very quickly, there is this tension that exists because the federal government, NHTSA, says don't regulate performance. Well, arguably, if you have a computer driving a car, that's related to safety now. So if a state can't certify if a system is safe because they're not supposed to regulate performance per NHTSA, how do you get around that? And I think that's the tension where we need potentially some leadership from federal government to say what type of systems are safe and can be tested in the states.
So I don't have much to add to what these two gentlemen said. One thing I would underscore is the value of getting more cars out there learning. The way the cars get better is by driving, and so regulations that allow for that are what we need. That's super helpful to us.
Are you seeing any regulations that are particularly helpful? Has some state done it right, where it make it easier for you than others?
Let's see. So
you can't say Michigan. I'm joking.
Hey, whoever's doing it,
right?
Gosh, everyone's a little bit different.
Everybody has good parts in them. If you could, all the bills that have been passed so far, debated, if you could kind of create a super bill from that, it's interesting.
So what would that be?
So I mean, just throw out some examples, and Matt can definitely chime in. So Tennessee was one of the first states to pass legislation last year, and one of the things that they put in the legislation is the ability to charge a VMT, vehicle miles tax or user fee, on the use of automated vehicles. And this goes to the question of infrastructure that we talked about a little earlier. how are we going to pay for any infrastructure that might be needed for these vehicles, whether it's sensors, whether it's lane striping, whether it's a road without potholes. I don't think any of us have ever driven on that type of road. So Tennessee has this user fee model. Then you have Michigan, which was one of the first ones to pass legislation saying that you can test any type of vehicle on our roads, Michigan and Florida. I mean, that's the type of, I think, testing that Matt is talking about with figuring out how do we deploy this. But then there's another approach that Arizona is taking and a couple other places, just issuing an executive order saying, we want to promote testing in conjunction with universities and in order to figure out how are these test projects. And if you track the testing that's going on, it's debatable whether it's successful on the city side, but you have kind of three key ingredients. You have a willing partner on the private side, you have a forward-thinking city, and then you have a research institution. So you think about Arizona has this happening at Tempe and ASU where Uber's testing. You see this in Pittsburgh with Carnegie Mellon and Pittsburgh trying to reinvent itself in Uber. So there's a lot of different concepts being discussed out there, but I don't think there's perfect legislation yet. And the danger that happens is getting definitions right. And we all know as lawyers, when you let legislators define things, they aren't necessarily the best definitions. And are we thinking about this existing framework of laws that was created in a time we were thinking about traditional vehicles?
That's a
Rick,
really...
I can jump in one second, which is that I can give you an example of a regulation that's bad, in my opinion, which is in the California proposed autonomous vehicle legislation, there's a regulation that says the manufacturers have to have a system by which if the car is under cybersecurity attack, it has to alert the user. If there's a zero attack, the first thing that an attacker will do will be to disable the warning system by which the user would be notified that there's a cyber attack going on. So that, in my mind, is completely useless and misleading because it gives somebody a false sense of security. I think that's a bad example of a bad regulation.
I'll tell you why that's even funnier for me. The car has to know that it's under attack. How does the car know that it's under attack? I mean, I know we're talking about artificial intelligence and all that stuff, but cars aren't going to know that they're under attack. You have to get forensic investigators to go and look and find out that there was an attack. So that one's even better because, yes, they'll disable it, but the car wouldn't be able to tell you anyway. And what would you do with that information?
You could have a constant monitoring function, but it's not really practical.
Yeah, what if you're having that glass of wine that I want after work? Are you supposed to take back control of the car? And then how does the car stop at a safe place on a freeway? It's kind of keep peeling the onion and more layers.
If I may note one more category that's particularly helpful is getting clarity from lawmakers on what they believe applies or doesn't apply. So in a lot of situations, you have laws on the books that could be read to apply to self-driving cars and would be very problematic for them. A good example is a seatbelt requirement. So if my computer is the driver, how do I belt it? It's nice to have yeah, so there are things like that it's great to just have clarity that, look, this doesn't apply.
And tailgating. I mean, think about that. If you have the platooning example that Steve used, and there's tailgating laws, but arguably in order to alleviate congestion and maximize the movement of vehicles on a freeway, you can tailgate them and fit more cars on roads, but you'd have to change your tailgating laws.
Well, and that it may be safer if they're able to sense each other too. I mean, right. So yeah, that's so sure.
Just kind of a quick question in this area, which is, there are engineering standard organizations, such as ASTM, which are not governmental, but which bring together all the kinds of parties we're talking about to develop engineering standards for many products. Is there any consideration of something like that?
I think that approach has a lot of promise, and maybe that those are the folks with the institutional expertise to be able to create some kind of standards rather than the government. I think the government is reticent to create a comprehensive list of standards. It may be that the industry develops a set of standards, and they have the manufacturers would get a certification saying that they've gone through the testing process and it's passed successfully. That's going to be a lighter touch as compared to a government pre-market approval process.
So, and that work is definitely happening in a lot of areas. So SAA, the Society of Automotive Engineers, is one of the key bodies here. And the Auto ISAC that was mentioned earlier was a conglomerate of professionals who came up with these practices. So yeah, it's happening.
Similar question to what he is talking about. We're talking about Washington is one of it is. So are the automotive manufacturers working on draft legislation which they are proposing?
Yes.
Including for privacy rights of those who are using it.
Say the last part again.
Including for privacy rights of people using it.
Any kind of a bill of rights, and there's so much of data points, like you mentioned, that there is an enormous scope for collecting data, including data about people sitting inside the car. And the enormous amount of data that these cars collect anyway, with millions of probably bytes of data in order to move around.
Right. So for us, so on the front end of taking pen to paper and writing a privacy law, we're not actively engaged in that, but we definitely weigh in on the laws that are proposed. Same for AV-specific regulations.
Laws that are proposed, or you are proposing laws as an industry body collectively?
So the Automakers Alliance is a group of a number of the big OEMs, and they do propose laws. GM has proposed some AV-specific laws that have then been melded into the Tennessee example, Georgia, Colorado. I'm not aware of the industry or any specific automaker proposing a privacy bill, but that might be happening.
Yeah, I would actually be very surprised.
Yeah.
So as I'm a privacy lawyer as well, I'd be very surprised if you see auto-specific privacy laws. You're more likely to see, I don't think you will, but you're more likely to see the U.S. move toward the European privacy model where, privacy is a fundamental human right in Europe, and therefore anybody who has your information, you have control over the use of that. Here in the U.S., we're kind of on the opposite end of it. So if people are that concerned about privacy, that would be the way that things would change. But that it's not just for vehicles. That's pervasive. That's everywhere. That's not happening anytime soon. But vehicles are just one example. Just a second. So the examples of legislation that we've been hearing about are really more around testing, which makes sense right now because that's where we need to be in order to get this industry going. But I guess I'd like you to project out a little bit, and let's say we are able to, it's 2025, 2030. What is legislation really going to, or regulation, I should say, really going to look like? And I'd like to include in this also the concept of liability and, responsibility for accidents or for other things that happen. And I'll just kind of preface it right now, if there is an accident and somebody, is injured or killed, but it's found to be an accident, there really isn't necessarily liability. Somebody isn't held liable. But I think that if it's a corporate-owned vehicle that is, programmed in a certain way, that there may be. So what is the legislation? What is regulation of this? And I know I'm projecting you guys out. What is it going to look like? How are we going to be dealing with those issues? So,
let me start.
Sure.
So, I'm not sure I agree with at least the initial predicate that if today there's an accident and if it's actually an accident, that there's no liability. an accident, it doesn't mean that something just happened, somebody did something wrong, and we can sort of talk about whether that somebody has better options, or whether, the old learn and hand formula, I don't mean to sort of cause PTSD here, but, what was the cost of doing whatever you did, what versus the cost of doing something else, et cetera. So just because it's an accident, you got distracted and therefore you rear-ended somebody, certainly you didn't mean to run that person off the road, but so I think there's still liability. So the question, though, is what happens when computer is driving? And what's even more complex is what happens actually in 2025, 2030, when you have some percentage of cars being computer-driven and some percentage of cars still being people-driven, right? And for that matter, even farther into the future, I don't know that everybody would want to switch over to. I imagine that some people, for example, who buy fancy cars like, Porsche 911s, they buy them because they like how it feels. They like sitting behind the wheel. They like sort of that, rush when you take that, take the roof down and you go down. And so I'm not necessarily sure that those individuals will necessarily switch into, the koala cars. And so what happens when you have a human on one side, computer on the other? And then there's several issues come up. Number one, how do we apportion blame? Number two, so for example, in Maryland, and I know Maryland is somewhat unique, only 5 states still do it. So Maryland, Virginia, District of Columbia, North Carolina, and Alabama for some reason. The first 4 kind of make sense. They're all in the sort of the Fourth Circuit. Alabama is kind of weird. But so in Maryland, we still have contributory negligence, right? We don't have comparative negligence, meaning that if you're 1% contributing to the accident, you get 0 recovery, right? So any contribution to the New York is comparative, so you get paid based on comparison. So how do you figure out, but most states, right? So in that sense, Maryland is somewhat easier. Any contribution bars recovery. But what about in New York when you have some contribution from the computer and some from a human being? How do you allocate the blame? And then the third issue is products liability. Now, again, just to remind those of you who haven't sort of done torts in a while, products liability is almost like a strict liability thing. And so if you manage to prove that there's a better program that is also equally inexpensive, so there's not much higher cost and doesn't cause other problems, so you just don't exchange problem A for problem B, you may show that there's basically, that's a claim for defective design. So the program that you're using is designed effectively because you could have designed a better program. Almost inevitably, there's going to be cars on the roads, even if there's going to be standard essential patents and there's going to be some sort of baseline standards. Almost inevitably, there's going to be cars with different computer programs running, the vehicles, and they'll make different choices depending on the situation. And then you get into a crash, and then you have saying, well, wait a second, but Honda had a different program, right? Why didn't you use that one as opposed to whatever you used on a Toyota? Not necessarily always a winnable claim, but it's certainly going to be easy to at least to make that initial showing saying, look, there's multiple options. You chose a wrong option. And so how are we going to figure out, how is the jury going to figure out which option is actually better? It's going to bring up a lot of interesting issues. And the good news is, I suppose, is that this is not solvable through regulation. This is going to take years, if not decades, of traditional common law development, which would be great for me because I'll be just able to teach new cases to my students. So, but.
I kind of agree that it's going to take a while before we'll come up with perfect regulation. But what I think for the future regulation, what important is that we will have it uniformed. So we'll not have different states having different regulations. So we'll have, for example, federal regulation that will help, for example, car manufacturer to comply with the law. And with regard to product liability, so the biggest question is, if we have an accident, who will be responsible? Would it be a driver or person who is in the car, or the software or the manufacturer that will go to the product liability as
or perhaps somebody who recently repaired it, right? Again, without even getting to the issue that somebody put malware into it, but just didn't do the good enough job, right? So there's so many potential claims that could be made. And it would be right for a great torts exam.
Well, I'll just say something very quickly, and it looks like the audience has some questions. I always like hearing what people think about what we're saying, but, just to go back to that point about the federal government catching up with technology, I think you kind of saw it hinted with former Secretary of Transportation Fox, but do we need a Department of Innovation within DOT? Do cities and states need to start writing innovation policies? I mean, one of the things that a federal automated vehicles policy says to do is for states to go and look at their existing regulations and ordinances to figure out whether or not there are any impediments to automated vehicles. I think you forget how intertwined and how many different codes you would have to search through. Maybe we need to start from scratch and just like you're saying, and figure out how do we start a uniform approach towards technology and how do we want it to work within our jurisdictions.
Rick, it's probably looked at this point that the Uniform Law Commission, the people who review the Uniform Commercial Code, formerly known as the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Law, are starting to form a study group on autonomous vehicles. So we might have something like the UCC for autonomous vehicles as a means of facilitating harmonization among states' laws. It's also probably worth adding that we look at these kinds of cases and say, well, like the Volvo CEO said, well, we'll take on the liability if the vehicle's an autonomous vehicle. I think that's too simplistic of an answer, because if I were the insurance defense lawyer and a file landed on my desk that was an accident involving an autonomous vehicle, I might say to myself, well, there might be other potential causes, like, well, maybe the county was negligent in maintaining the roads. Maybe the owner failed to bring the car in for the updates. Maybe the owner failed to keep the car in good repair that had to do with some mechanical or electrical system that the owner failed to keep in good repair, as opposed to some fault with the autonomous driving system. There might be a number of other parties involved: the big data service provider, the repair company, the infrastructure, cloud infrastructure provider. There could be a lot of parties that could be responsible for this accident, and not just simply the auto manufacturer if it's on automated mode and it's otherwise the driver if it was in manual mode.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. And also the comment about we're going to probably see this develop through the common law as opposed to through a law that's put down preemptively. But getting back to your original question of 10, 15 years down the road, there are proposals going out there from academics about how we can look at liability through a legislative approach. And there's a good one, an interesting one that's, if you're interested in this stuff, I would highly recommend it. It's from actually an NYU law professor, Mark Geisfeld, who I hope is here because I'm not going to do his paper justice, but I would commend it to people who are interested in the topic because it's kind of a mind-changing approach to liability in the sphere of autonomous vehicles. Mark Geisfeld. The paper is called Geistfeld. It's forthcoming in the Cal Law Review. It was in the NYU working paper series. The paper is called Roadmap for Autonomous Vehicles. And so his idea is to view autonomous vehicles as a system because instead of having individual drivers, there is one source code that drives the same way for all cars. And so viewed on aggregate, are your cars safer than a human car? You get enough data to show that. And then if you adequately warn a passenger in your autonomous vehicle of the risk associated with getting in it, which is proven to be less than getting in a human-driven car, if something happens, then the system has acted properly.
Unless, of course, with the kind of the issue that I brought up, unless, of course, there's a different autonomous car that acts somewhat differently, and so the risk may be, at some point it becomes hard to compare. So the case that I teach to my students, it was brought up as a product liability case. So in the 1990s, there was a girl, her car rolled off the road. She ended up in a lake and ultimately up drowning because, if those of you remember, very popular in the 90s, there were automatic seatbelts. Remember, they would open the door and it would go up and down. And I think she was driving a Honda, and I think a Honda had the buckle, so you could actually undo the seatbelt. but I think the Honda buckle was at the hip level, while the Toyota buckle was at the shoulder level. And because the Honda buckle was at the hip level, the belt got stuck midway through, and the firefighters rescuers who were trying to get her out couldn't reach. And so by the time they were trying to finagle and open the door and undo the seatbelt, she unfortunately drowned. And so the claim was like, you could have made it Toyota-like. You could have put the buckle up top, and that way it would have been easier to get her out. And ultimately, the court sided against the girl, saying that's true, and it would have been better for you, but it would have caused problems for potentially other people. And so this issue of like, well, how do you weigh the risks, right? So when we have different source codes, which risks do you tell people, which you don't? How do you weigh them, and so on?
This is so very valid, and I would prefer Mark to defend his own paper, but he does, his approach for it is look at how much the car is insured for. He's basing the insurer of the vehicle is going to assess the risk, and the insurance premium that is on automaker X's autonomous vehicle versus automaker Y's can indicate to you what you're getting. But it's kind of it's an interesting, different view on liability. It's very futuristic. I don't think it's realistic at this moment, but it's, if things are changing, it's worth thinking and discussing.
Okay, so we'll take some questions. So
back over
there, you've been waiting very patiently.
Because there's one aspect of this from a governmental standpoint and everything. First of all, I think the technology is moving so much faster than anything thought. I think it's moving very, very fast to solve a lot of these problems. My daughter, just graduated from college, doesn't give a darn about privacy, okay? And anybody younger than now really doesn't care that much. And I think that's going to be a part of this. But my point is, if you had a cure for breast cancer, wouldn't you be devoting an incredible amount of government resources to bring it to the market? We have, every year for the last 3 years, highway deaths have increased because of people texting and distracted driving and the like. We have a chance, and you talk about liability and accidents and everything else. If we get to stage 4 and 5, and I think it's going to be a lot before 2035, although Stephen knows a lot more about it than I do, obviously, but I think it's going to be long before that. I think it's going to be more like
I think the comment of 2035 is to say that's when they will dominate. They will be dominating the market.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue. I'm certainly not going to argue with you, but I'd like to make my point, which is that we ought to be declaring war on traffic deaths. Right now, it's criminal to allow 40,000 people a year. I mean, by 2035, that'd be 650,000 deaths. That's more than we lost in World War II. Or no, not quite. But anyway, you get my point. And I'd like to ask Greg and others what you think the federal government should be doing to encourage as quickly as possible.
I think that's a great point, and something I'm very excited about is the potential transformative effects, kind of what I talked about. And I think one way you can see the federal government do this is at the beginning of this year they announced DOT proving grounds. So these are proving grounds for automated vehicles. Are hopefully more real life testing to then get data from the testing. But to your point, so for example, where the federal government has power is through money, and it gives out money through grant programs. So you see that through the Federal Transit Administration. One of the hot topics right now is transit-oriented development. So it's, giving grants towards new development that's close to transit. Well, what if then, as part of that, a transit-oriented development, you also banned car ownership within these TODs to then promote the use of public transportation or the use of Uber or Lyfts or the use of public transportation? It gets to, people need more options for transit. And then it gets to that tension that I was talking about. At what point do cities, I like your word, declare war on congestion? Do you take away a lane to then force people to take public transportation to get cars off the roads? In my mind, I'm excited about a potential fleet model for automated vehicles. So that's just another option for people to be able to take within cities. I would love to look at my phone to see the price comparisons between me getting into an automated car, me taking a bike share, me taking a public transit, to then make that decision based on how fast I need to get someplace and what mood I'm in. Sometimes I enjoy being on the train and just looking out and listening to music. Other times I need to get someplace quickly and be in my car. So I think you're right, and that is a way the federal government can potentially stimulate this through grant funding and trying to promote new uses of technology.
I mean, among my colleagues, I'm often known, so I'm a one-trick pony. And so my answer to a lot of what can government do is very often stop mucking around with the patent system. Because, you know, they do, and they shouldn't. Because ultimately, yes, we can have government grants, and yes, but unlike the public's wealth, which is in some sense unlimited, because by creating new things, you're actually creating wealth, government's amount of money is only what they take from us. Now, look, I'm not the type of guy who's going to sit there and say all taxation is theft. That's not my thing. But government only has money because it takes part of the wealth that's produced in the country, right? And so as a result, necessarily, we can have more wealth or we can have less. We can have higher tax rate or lower tax rate. But necessarily, whatever tax rate we have, government's money is limited, and they have to pay for a whole bunch of other things as well. So the way to do it, or at least one of the things they should do, right, is they should promote private entrepreneurship and make sure that people who do put their money on the line and do put their time and invest their both life savings and life work into this actually have at the very least a realistic prospect, not a certainty, because, you know, technology can fail. And somebody, you know, can lap you because, you know, boy, you're competing for this and somebody invents first. But they actually have, if they do meet the requirements, they have secure rights in their invention. And with this, including secure rights in their inventions of algorithms, code, and so on, something that Supreme Court has unfortunately been attacking as something potentially non-patentable. And that, in my view, is a bad thing.
Oh, we could have all kinds of conversations.
Oh, yes, we can. I mean, I'm a minority in academia on this, but that's kind of, you know.
Why don't we?
My question is, I keep thinking about the effect on law enforcement. You know, every day, police officers stop cars for a simple traffic infraction and uncover drugs and guns, a lot of guns, in New York City. And if there is a driverless car that either won't commit a traffic infraction, I suppose, or if it does, then your point would be for the police officer to stop that car, but nobody can get a citation for it. And then if you have some cars have drivers and some don't, you know, regular old-fashioned cars and then new driverless cars, well, would that make it easier for criminals to just, when they want a traffic thing, just be in a driverless car? And how do we deal with that? Is the way to do it to allow basically the automobile version of stop and frisk? Police officers can just stop cars for no reason because as a public safety measure? And then would that promote the targeting of certain types of vehicles or certain types of passengers or something like that?
I mean, one would think it would be the opposite, right? So if you are driving around, it's a driverless car with now you can have tinted windows, right? So the threat of driving while black might very well be reduced, right? Because the cops would have no idea who's there, right? The car is doing its own thing, right? And so at the same time, again, so those of you who remember your criminal procedure and search and seizure from the law school, I'm terrible with case names, but I remember the case. So there's cops stop this car, they discover a whole bunch of drugs, the search is challenged, goes over to the Supreme Court, and the question is like, why this car? And so it's like, well, you know, it fit the profile. What's the profile? So like, well, I was driving up and down I-95 a lot from Miami to New York, and that's a known drug dealer's route. Supreme Court ultimately bought that, for better or worse. But that seems actually, if they're buying that seems to be much cruder than what the information you can get from driving cars. So, like, you know, it cuts both ways. Cops actually may have more opportunity to stop drug dealers, while at the same time have fewer opportunities to stop people because they don't look the right way, right? Because they're behind tinted windows, but front, back, side, and cars doing its own thing.
I think police will just have to use alternative techniques. So sorry, we had somebody in the back over here.
About the model with the premise liability and without the model, wouldn't that require the divulging of the intellectual property, potentially? And that could also, does that mean that we want to go with an open source sort of a system to try to, so you can actually make that comparison? Because technically, you know, we have GM versus Tesla. I'm not going to know this if I'm a typical, you know, consumer.
Yeah, in litigation, you're going to end up, I mean, they may end up being, or doing those kinds of comparisons under seal or whatever. Is an open source model a good idea? Perhaps. Open standards, or at least for encryption, are better. So if you're able to beat on the encryption algorithm, people are able to do that, that it's a safer one than a proprietary algorithm. So you may see things like that come out in some of these areas. So it's going to be kind of an interesting thing. But how that's going to play out, I don't think any of us can even, I'm not even sure I'm not even sure Steve can predict that.
And also, to the extent things actually protected by patent as opposed to a trade secret, patents are a public document, right? So patents you can actually pull up and see what they say. Now, unfortunately, there's a whole new language of patentees where they seem to say a lot without saying actually anything. So under seal could be one, patent reference another. Right.
There, that it's going to take a period of time in order for that to come up.
Right.
So there's a case out there waiting for you.
The whole tort area is going to take time to settle out on this. So yeah.
I have a question about the accountability of these black box systems, or sort of on the flip side of that, you have to sort of program in decisions, like morality decisions, and the trolley problem. What do you think about that? We're going to talk about software.
So that's two questions: the black boxes, and then the morality of or ethics, or however you want to say it, of the programming decisions. So maybe I'd like to take that second one first, and start with Mr. Wu. Start with Steve over there. So what are your
writing an article on this very issue. The National Academy of Science and Engineering has a grant supporting the work of Patrick Lynn, who's a professor of philosophy at Cal Poly. He has asked me to write about this issue. I'm looking at this crossover between law and ethics. Law is not the same as morality. We have this distinction between what's right and what's legal. Something could be legal but not right. Something could be right but not legal in this sense. And the hypothetical that I have in this article is, imagine a situation where manufacturers know that a crash is inevitable, and they know that cars could get in these situations where it's headed, for example, towards a large group of people. If the car manufacturer does nothing, and the car just continues to go in a straight line, the car could run over that large group of people and harm or kill that large group of people. But as an alternative, the car could steer away from that large group of people at the cost of running over a single person and harming that single person. There are a lot of moral philosophers who would say in that situation, and this is a form of what's called the trolley problem, because the original hypothetical like this had to do with trolleys and pulling a switch to allow a trolley to, instead of run over 5 people on the track, move to a side track at the cost of running over a single person. Is it better to save more lives, or is it better to avoid causing harm, like aiming the trolley towards a single individual? The same Patrick Lynn has written broadly in his articles in popular media about this problem applied to manufacturing autonomous vehicles, and saying manufacturers are going to have to think about these hypotheticals, because they could have situations like this. Unlikely, yes, but it forces us to think about how manufacturers value passengers versus pedestrians versus people on the road, and so forth. So Patrick has written a lot about it. My take on this is, what would be the tort implication of allowing, as a manufacturer, allowing the car to just run over the 10 people if it had a situation like that? And you could say, would a manufacturer be sued? Yes. Would a manufacturer lose that suit? Yes, because there's a safer alternative design, steering away from the large group of people. And then the flip side of that is, if the manufacturer said, let's do the ethical thing, because most philosophers would believe in pulling the switch or saving more lives, let's aim towards the single person, then that person who got singled out, could that person sue the manufacturer for the harm caused to that person? Yes. Would that person win? Probably yes. Because this person's saying, why did you aim it towards me? You picked me out. So it looks like almost an intentional aiming of the car towards me. And so there seems to be this damned if you do, damned if you don't situation under current law. Obviously, you can change the law, but my legal position is that under the circumstances, the best course of action from a legally defensible position is to try to fight against the hypothetical and avoid crashing into either the 10 or the 1. But under Patrick Lynn's hypothetical, we assume that you may risk harming the 11 instead of just 10 or 1. So you could make things worse. And I think it's more legally defensible to risk making things worse than it would be either allowing the car to run over the 10 or aiming at the 1.
So Matt, I'd like to get your but I'll just throw a little twist into the hypothetical. Either it's going to hit the 1 or it turns and hits the wall and kills the passenger. So you got 1 versus 1, and to make it
also, things I've been discussing in the article is the fact that our consumer protection laws give a weight towards protecting the owner, the person who purchased the car, the consumer who purchased the car. That owner has primacy over other pedestrians. So when you have that 1 versus 1, I think the law is favoring the consumer over the pedestrian.
Yeah, but if we're talking fleets, which I think is probably a more likely thing, and you're just doing it as a service, and I'd like to get Matt's view on this. I think the analysis of that is going to be even a little more complicated because it's not a manufacturer who's going to be making that programming decision. We're talking artificial intelligence with deep learning at this point and learning based on data. The machines are writing the code. You're probably not going to have an individual who writes that code. It's probably going to be changed based on a variety, based on all of these inputs, and you're going to have dynamic changes to the code based on that. So if you
I don't know if we're going to code writing code today with auto manufacturing. Maybe Matt can jump in on that. I think that may be a little bit farther down the road.
Well, if you look at Google's basic mode of operation, that is, I mean, I don't know with their autonomous vehicles, but that is what they do. They do not know until they go back what the exact code is that is being used there, because it's much faster at collecting the information and changing things to optimize. So you don't know until it goes back. So I guess, Matt, I'd like you hear about this stuff all the time, I'm sure.
So maybe we'll do a little AI, machine learning 101 real quick for the benefit of everybody else. A rough way that I would describe it is, an easy example is, we want to train a computer how to identify red lights. So what I do is I take 100 pictures of red lights and I take 100 pictures of lights that look like red lights, and then I tell the computer that, yes, this is properly a stoplight. This one is actually a blinking bike light. And you do that millions and millions of times, and then the computer starts to be able to do that itself. So that's, I think, what you're talking about in terms of a car knowing how to act. So red light versus not a red light is an easy one. Slam on brakes, turn right, hit gas is significantly more complex. So my answer of will the car be making its own decision or will that be written by a person is it might be. It depends on who you're talking to. Right now, for full-on car making all the decisions, I'm not aware of anybody doing that. So that's that. In the context of these ethical decisions, I mean, we have to keep talking and get more input. One of the things that's been valuable is discussions like these, and there are some professors doing research on it. If you're involved in the sphere, you've probably heard about it. These guys at MIT have a website you can go to, and they put these problems out to you, and you have to pick. it's hard. I mean, they say there's an Olympic athlete and a 3-year-old. Make your choice. And so, I can imagine a world in which you get in your car and you have to do this questionnaire, and they say, okay, make your choice. And probably most importantly, which Stephen mentioned, is that we don't ever want to get there. So the things that I spend my time doing and that my engineers spend their time doing is making sure that we don't ever have this situation happen. And that's what's most important.
And I think we were talking about this before our panel, I think this is where the connectivity part becomes important. So all of us have driven through neighborhoods and you see kids playing sign. Imagine if that sign then communicates a beacon to the car saying, there's kids playing right now, slow down. I think that's how we alleviate the pressure from these situations. This is a high bike lane area. This gets to separating bikes from cars, manage lanes, things like that. Goes back to the planning side of this. And also why I think connectivity is such a huge potential fail-safe in this, even though with the risks from the cybersecurity side and the privacy side, also, these mapping systems, the LiDAR, why not have another additional fail-safe, which is going to be the connected side too?
And that's, at the first order approximation, that works. But to paraphrase one of my favorite books, there's a scene where, this guy, the book itself is a take on Faustus, Dr. Faustus. And so, seeing the devil arise in Moscow, and he debates with the people there whether or not God exists and good and evil. And so, at some point he says, look, the problem is not that human beings die. The problem is that they die unexpectedly, okay, and they can't predict it. And so same thing here. You can have a beacon saying children are playing, and you can have these lanes. The problem is the human beings, not that they show up on the road, is that they show up there unexpectedly. And we are not, until we get into the car, we're not connected. We live in New York City, or we're visiting New York City, right? We know, how many of us have seen, or for that matter have been, the person who just darted out in front of a car,
walked out texting.
Right? So, and that's kind of a problem. Unless we sort of start wearing some sort of beacons in our lapels, that becomes sort of a problem.
We're all wearing Fitbits. Why not have it?
No, I'm wearing an old-fashioned mechanical watch.
And Rick, to add a wrinkle to this, people are talking about now the possibility of immunity devices. If we have some kind of targeting where cars are going to try to steer away from the large group towards a single individual, maybe some individuals would have a device that prevents them from being targeted. You might think, well, certainly the president's motorcade is going to have a device like that. Or maybe we give one to the governor of the state, or the mayor, or someone. You start pulling out hypotheticals, and then you get into individual live questions like, can the rich buy a don't target an immunity device by just paying more money, So if we start getting into other issues about communities, if we allow for immunity.
Follow up on this question about what the department did and what the reality of the programming is. I'm sure the programming is basically trying to just navigate the car so it doesn't get hit. Is there, at some point, was the programming say, okay, that's not possible, I now have to plan B, scan what's in front of me, and what's the safest place to go? Or is that not even where we are yet? And, would the car be able to determine that's a human versus that's just a shape, that's something I just need to avoid? Does it know that's a human?
Yeah, so classifying is super important, but we probably can't classify Olympic athlete versus professor.
Good.
So they're actually getting there. The interesting, there's an interesting report. This Google scanned YouTube, the little, scene things, and it was able to actually determine, of course, cats. It was able to come up and knew what a cat was. It didn't know that it was a cat, but it actually was able to figure out that it was a cat. Now, of course, because that's what YouTube is for. YouTube is for cat videos. So, but it showed it's getting everything. And what the thing that it picked out was it knew then what cats were. So this is where I'm talking about machine learning, and when you're getting into that, we are getting to the point, maybe not an Olympic athlete but will they be able to determine what a human is? At some point, they'll have a high likelihood of doing that, and they'll be learning more as it goes that, yes, this is versus that. Now they have problems with, something's cut in half because of a tree in the middle. They may not be able to tell what it is, but those things are changing very rapidly. So they will be able to tell these things, or at least partially. So they may be able to tell that this person's a human, but this person's partly blocked over there, so they don't know. So we're going to get into some very interesting areas as a result. Now, we only have a short time left, so I'd just like to, we haven't talked about insurance at all, right? What is this going to mean for insurance? Let's just talk about that. What is it going to mean for the insurance industry? Right now, you insure drivers. What are you going to, and I can tell you from talking to people in the insurance industry, they don't know. So I'd be really interested in hearing from you guys what you think this is going to mean for what is an insurance industry in the automotive universe where you have automated vehicles.
So I'll let this team speak.
Where I have to shift from the insurance model today where drivers, operators are insured and the owners to where we have a system where manufacturers are going to need to beef up their product liability insurance because that's going to bear the brunt of the liability, but that we will not see the disappearance of owner car insurance because there's going to still be some residual risk. It may be that this car is damaged because of a dart out or a non-automated vehicle or some other type of accident, road conditions causing the accident and so forth. So I still think there's a place for owner coverage. And there might be some owner liability, even third-party liability, if you're talking about the owner failed to update the software or the owner failed to maintain the car. So there's going to be some kind of residual risk. This should be priced at a lot lower level than it is today, but I don't think it's zero.
And just a follow-up question, how would the insurance company calculate the premium if there is no driver? So would they get a data from a car? How often do you drive?
Well, they do that now, right? So they, not Geico, what I have, Progressive, right? They send you this little device and you hook it up underneath and so they track you for 30 days. You don't have to, right? But you can get up to 15% off. So they track you for 30 days. They actually track your speed. They track how many hard stops you have. They track how many miles per day you drive. So they collect all this data, and then at the end of 30 days, they send you an email saying, based on your driving, you get 4% discount because you're not awesome, but you're not totally terrible, right? Or you get like 0% discount or whatever. So they do that now.
Well, so insurance is based on claims data. And if the rate of accidents go down, the insurance claims go down. It's really based on models that are based on claims data. But if we reduce the number of accidents down to such a level that there are very, very few, these insurance companies, the large number of insurance companies, will they still be there? I mean, it's a fascinating.
The ones that are focusing on owner coverage. The ones that are doing product liability continue to be in business, so the owner coverage business is going to go down. The aggregate risk is going to go down because there are going to be fewer accidents and therefore fewer claims. But you're going to have to shift your coverage to covering product liability as opposed to owners. There'll still be some coverage for the ownership, but you're not going to get much premium dollar for it.
I imagine some states may want to move to no fault, where basically you're insuring yourself in case something happens and you'll get injured. So you will, and then we'll have to really, the only people then we'll have to think about really are the pedestrians, right? Because if you injure somebody else in the car, they also will have a no fault insurance, but it's really then the pedestrians
So maybe you're buying insurance as a pedestrian.
Maybe you're buying insurance as a pedestrian.
I mean, the whole model of insurance may change.
I mean, then again,
Homeowners or renters insurance, you could add a rider to that.
Yeah.
And I think we only have time for one more question, and we should finish up.
For the level 4 of cars, will there be governors if they will not exceed the speed?
Will there be governors so that you're limited to following a speed limit, for example? So you asked about level 4 or 5. I'll say what exists now in level 2 in the Tesla car. If you go by analogy from cruise control, I'm not aware of any cruise control that will not let you set itself before. So the Tesla Autopilot, I think this, it'll let you go 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. And that's a question we haven't answered yet. Well, we have answered it by default of following the law, and you don't get that setting. But maybe people don't want that. People want to be able to set their car to go to 80, and that would complicate the liability question even further. I was thinking about this the other day, and if I am a manufacturer and I make my car follow the law to the T, but I give you the option, and then when you say, no, I want to drive fast, and I'm going to aggressively lane merge, and I'm going to blow through lights, can a manufacturer warn you to some extent and put it back on you? I don't know if people will push back enough and say they want that ability. Maybe, maybe not. But if they do, I would see some of the liability going back to the individual who's setting these preferences. Could be. I mean, you can't wait. I guess it would be a waiver of what happens to you, but what you cause to others.
I guess let's maybe finish up. Let's maybe finish up with you on this.
Yeah. So on a third-party liability, right? So I can see in that situation again. It would be a great torts exam. I can see in that situation. So again, if you're the pedestrian, or for that matter, another driver that is following the law, gets hit by a car that was given an option, even though all sorts of red lights are flashing saying you're above the speed limit and you're ignoring it, right? You could be sued for breaking the law, right? And in fact, you may very well be, even aside from criminal, but you negligent per se, right? Because you're not following the law. But why not bring a case against those guys saying they could have prevented it, right? All they have to do is put a code saying that, not to permit that to happen, right? That's all it is. And they didn't when they could have, right? So is that always a winnable suit? No, but is that a suit that would be brought? Absolutely.
Or you take it a step further in the connected side, and if, the city's in control of the infrastructure or the highway, do they then have the obligation to say, this car is driving reckless, I'm going to take control and slow it down? And that throws a whole other wrinkle into the whole law situation, and what right do they have to do that?
It's also important to consider the possibility of an emergency. Somebody's driving to the hospital because of a medical emergency. Do you need to have an override function?
Or can fire trucks finally push everybody aside and say, we're going to go now?
Well, on that note, I would just like to thank our wonderful panel here. It's been great. I would like to especially thank Irene for putting this together, and Henry. I mean, this is a wonderful evening, so thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. It's really great turnout, and I thought it was a great panel. So thank you to all of the speakers from me as well. And I'm not sure if any of you are planning on sticking around to answer questions afterwards, but I think this concludes the panel part of it. Thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Okay. And by the way, doesn't give our privacy now. When she starts having children, or when she starts looking for jobs, if you look at her Facebook page when she's 17.
It's on Chevy.